He said, "You know what this is?" I said, "Yeah, it's a razor blade." He said, "I got you at my mercy, don't you?"
And here, they were guards and I was a convict. And that's the way it was. You knew where you were.
He says, "I wish you would just learn to behave like ladies."
And he said, "If you draw any blood, I'll kill every man in there." So the man dropped the knife and turned to the other men that were with him that he had set loose out of the various cells and said, "Well, he means it. He'll kill us if we don't give up." So they gave up.
You do your own number, you do your own time. If you hear something, you keep it within yourself. If you see something, you're blind to it. I don't care if it's a killing or whatever. You just don't see it.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to our very first episode of Behind Gray Walls, a podcast about the history of the old Idaho State Penitentiary and the men and women that serve behind these walls. My name is Anthony. I'm joined in the studio here with Sky.
Hi, everyone.
This is the introductory episode. We're going to talk about basically the history of Idaho and then hopefully brief history of the prison.
Anthony, looking at you. Brief.
It's so hard. There's so much history to get through. So I think we should start with ourselves.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you want to go first?
No, you go ahead.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Sky. I have been working out here at the pen. I volunteered starting when I graduated with my bachelor's degree in 2015. I volunteered / interned here for a couple summers, and then I left. I went to Wyoming. I got my master's degree, and then I came back and I needed a job, and everyone here at the old pen was gracious enough to take me back.
Oh my gosh. Sky gave probably 200 tours in about, 2 months?
Is that true?
I mean, that first summer you were here, you gave like every other tour. I do
actually remember that now.
I just remember going like, wow, I can't believe she's so happy.
I mean, like, so my undergrad and my graduate degrees were in history, and I'm going to get my PhD in history. And so like history is my whole life. And so to be able to find such an awesome site out here in Boise that does such awesome stuff, I was so happy to be here. And I remember loving it so much. And I was so glad that they took me back out here. But I was born and raised in Boise. I've gone to school in Utah, in Wyoming, and then I'll head to Texas here soon. So, but Idaho is my home. And so I get excited about being here and telling people stories of the stuff that happened out here. So that's me.
That's great. My name is Anthony, and I am also born and raised here in Boise, Idaho. Went to Bora High School. Sony
There
Bora.
you go, yeah.
Yeah.
Go Lions.
Go Lions.
My mom was a Bora.
What?
Yeah,
Cool.
alum.
Nice. I went to College of Idaho and got a degree in history and in music theory and composition. So after that, I worked for the city, the Boise City Department of Arts and History, during our city's sesquicentennial, our 150-year anniversary. So if you ever came to the Sesqui shop, I was the guy who was smiley and in there and helping you with whatever it was, because that was my favorite place. And then
He's still smiling and helps you with whatever you want.
I try. And then after my contract with the city went up, this job here at the old pen opened up, and I've been here now for 5 years. So, I still don't feel like a specialist, but
He's a liar
love
because
this place
there
and the
is
history here.
nothing that he does not know about this prison.
It's
like,
not entirely true. There are a lot of things that I learn every day.
There are very few. You can't surprise him. I'm always like, hey, did you know this thing? And he's like, oh, yeah, I read that like 6 years ago.
that,
And I'm just like, what? Yeah, he knows everything.
Oh, I don't mean to.
I don't mean to.
It's still exciting when you bring things that you're excited about.
No, it's...
my first couple of years, it was just like, Anthony, learn everything that you can, or else just answer the phones. And so, that's where I started.
Yeah.
It was just digging these things up, and a lot of it was revisionism, just like refinding the same stuff and then reinterpreting it to, because most of it was done in the 90s and early 2000s. And so now it's like we have a whole new view to look at all this history and penology and everything else. So, yeah.
If you ever have research questions or anything, get in touch with Anthony. hopefully he has enough time. We're always putting stuff on his plate,
I'm
including
always
this
finding time.
podcast.
Don't worry. I love it. It's my favorite thing to do. When you reach out and ask me about like your grandpa who served time here in the 30s or something, maybe your grandpa would probably be serving here in the 60s, but your great grandpa, he stole a ham or something and you want to know about it. And then, I love digging those stories up and then hearing your side of the story. So, anything that he told you about his experience or she, as we get to here, that's my favorite thing. So yeah, request away. I love it.
Yeah. So should we dig in? So as we
Let's do
said,
it.
our very first episode, we kind of want to set a basis of the prison. I would imagine most of our listeners are from Idaho, so they may know a lot of this stuff already. A lot of people may have visited the penitentiary a lot before, but we're hoping to dig a little bit into the history of the state, the history of the site, and then into these inmate stories. We do tell quite a few, but there's still so much, even in the stories that we do tell, the details that we don't get to talk about a little bit. So I think today we are going to start, I'll start with the history of the state of Idaho. And I'm only going to go up to literally until Idaho becomes a state. So I guess really I'm doing the history of the territory. But that's when the penitentiary history begins as well. So, so some sources. I mostly found a lot of this information on the reference series on the official Idaho State Historical Society website. Always a good place to start because the State Historical Society is kind of the official, bastion of history, obviously, as the name would suggest. And so if you guys are interested in finding some of these references or you want to find more, because they do have more, if you go to history.idaho.gov/reference-series. So got a lot of information from that. There are some kind of like anecdotes and stuff I took from Wikipedia. Again, don't start your research there. It's not a great place to start, but it can give some good supplemental information as long as it's cited correctly. Please look at those citations on the bottom.
Look at the citation and just click on them, and those are sometimes amazing.
Yeah. There's some good stuff. And then sometimes, if I needed to, I looked at official city websites. So there is evidence of people in what is now Idaho back about 14,000 years ago. I think I read that in the 1950s they found artifacts in a cave in Twin Falls that dated all the way back to then. So, prehistory people. And then, of course, up until European colonization, Native Americans were the only people in the territory that eventually makes up the state. Now, in the state, as of 2019, we have 5 main tribes: the Kootenai, Coeur d'Alene, Nez Perce, and those 3 are all in the north. And then in the south, we have the Shoshone Bannock and the Northern Paiute. And all of these names are going to be pretty familiar. We have a lot of inmates that come from these tribes, and then all of them, there's areas, whether they're counties or whether they're cities, that are named after these tribes as well. There were other tribes that kind of occupied parts of Idaho. We've got the Blackfeet, the Crow, the Kalispel. Trading events are going to bring people from around, natives from the different areas into the Idaho area, but not all of them settled here. Most of them, the Kalispel, I think their main reservation is in Washington. The Blackfeet and the Crow are in Montana. So we do have evidence of those tribes here in Idaho. They just aren't quote unquote native to the state, which I hate to say because Idaho is a white person construct. But again, we have 5 different actually Native American reservations in the state. And as many of us know, the reservation system was kind of the U.S. government's way of controlling the land as white people began to settle it. There is a really interesting book I actually read during an American Indian class I took during my master's degree. And if you're interested at all in kind of digging into the way that the federal government treated Native Americans, they treated them basically like fathers and mothers. The white people were here. The U.S. government was here to kind of like raise the Native Americans and assimilate them into our culture, and and it like breaks my heart. But if you're interested in that, there's a really excellent book. It's by a scholar named Kathleen D. Cahill. It's called Federal Fathers and Mothers, A Social History of the United States Indian Service, 1869 to 1933. Nice. It's really, really good. So if you're interested at all in the way that kind of the reservation system shaped the way that we view Native Americans and the view that they had in the late 19th, early 20th century, definitely check out that book. Because I don't want to get too into it. It's not necessarily my place to do so. And I wish I could say the story was different, but you and I are capitalizing off the fact that white people took advantage of these natives and took them off their land and gave them not like, I don't even want to say a portion because that makes it sound like it's a lot.
Right.
Native Americans currently hold 0.03% of land in the state of Idaho, where this was all their land. Yeah. It's a little upsetting to me. I don't want to get into it. That's not what we're here for. Again, 5 reservations. The Nez Perce Reservation, mainly the Nez Perce tribe. It's only about 1,200 square miles, only about 17,000. And this was in 2000. I don't know why the population numbers were from almost 20 years ago, why there isn't any more recent data. But as of 2000, 17,000 natives lived there. Coeur d'Alene Reservation, again for the Coeur d'Alene tribe, 523 square miles, about 6,500 people. The Fort Hall Indian Reservation, Shoshone-Bannock tribes, 814 square miles, about 6,000. Wow. The Kootenai Reservation, again, the Kootenai tribe, that's a pretty small one. It's up north. Only about 75 people live there. Wow. And the majority of the rest of the tribe exists on the Flathead Reservation in western Montana. Okay. That's one of the smaller ones. I haven't found any inmates from that reservation. I think I found ones from all the rest. Yeah. And then the last one we have is the Duck Valley Reservation. That's the Shoshone-Paiute tribes, 450 square miles. And it actually is split evenly between 2 states, between Idaho and Nevada. Yeah. So that's kind of interesting. And then the population there is about 1,200. Mm-hmm. So then, natives were, the only people here. Mm-hmm. The main European exploration that changed that was the Lewis and Clark expedition. They were the first main Europeans to cross through Idaho territory. Some fur trappers had sort of already passed through, but they didn't settle. They just sort of, were on, there's no one to, you can sell to the natives and then you move on. Yeah. So Lewis and Clark came through Idaho in 1805. Most of us know this from our classes.
4th grade.
Yeah. So listen, here's what I remember about 4th grade history class. Not a lot. Yeah. I remember that we had to make binders so that we could keep all of our information. Wow. And my binder had, do you know American Girl dolls? So they're super fun because I've always been a history nerd. And so these American Girl dolls, they're these little characters, and you have dolls that you play with, but they have stories about these girls in different time periods. Okay. So they had one who was Native American. I think her name was Josephine, and I want to say she was from an Idaho tribe.
Interesting.
So I had a picture of her on my binder, and there was a horse on it, and then the only thing I remember doing in 4th grade history is we made salt dough maps of the topography of Idaho. Oh, so we had to make the mountain ranges and everything. Wow. That's all I remember. So if my history is real rusty and real incorrect, then my apologies. It has been a hot second since I've studied Idaho history.
20 years. I can't remember being 10.
Yeah, 10, yes. For those of us who have not taken history since 4th grade and don't remember, Lewis and Clark expeditions sent by Thomas Jefferson to explore and map territory gained through the Louisiana Purchase, which Jefferson bought from the French in 1803. And actually, Idaho technically wasn't part of that purchase. It actually was all part of the Oregon Territory, which was owned by the British at the time. But they had Manifest Destiny, which the country was supposed to span from coast to coast. So Lewis and Clark were going to go through and they were going to map all of that out. And that was going to be our country. And it ended up doing exactly that. So Lewis and Clark actually encountered some Lemhi Shoshone natives. And this is kind of one of the first times we have main interactions of Europeans and natives. Sacagawea, who was the main Lewis and Clark guide, was actually born near Salmon. Yeah. So she technically is an Idahoan, but obviously she's much more Shoshone. Mm-hmm. She would obviously describe herself as a tribal member rather than an Idahoan, but we can at least kind of claim that. She is buried in Wyoming, interestingly enough.
Really?
Yeah, she's buried on the Wind River Reservation, supposedly. It's a big rumor, but we know she was born in Idaho. Yeah. So. by the time the Europeans show up, the southern tribes are having a really difficult time with the Blackfeet, who again are, I think, mostly from Montana. And the Blackfeet have guns from trappers. And so these southern tribes need to take advantage of the fact that these new Europeans coming in also have guns. And so the whites not only supply the natives with guns, but they also taught them agriculture, which then effectively ended the native way of life. And so then we were able to then parcel them onto reservations and create, unfortunately, the system that we have now. So the European peoples in Idaho after Lewis and Clark were mostly fur trappers coming south from French Canada. There are a few major forts in Lewiston, which is up north, in Boise, in Pocatello, which is southeast, and then there were trade posts throughout the area. The Oregon Trail cut through Idaho, and then there were a lot of Mormons who settled in Utah and came up north thinking they were still in Utah, and settled a lot of southern Idaho. We've got a lot of LDS in that area. And then, so Idaho becomes a territory in 1863. Abraham Lincoln signs an act of Congress declaring the area the Idaho Territory. It was created out of the Washington Territory, which had been separated from the Oregon Territory. And so Lewiston was the original territorial capital because up north was like prime location for mining. And that's what the Idaho Territory and really the early 20th century, I'd say Idaho was best known for, was its mining. Absolutely. Lots of gold, lots of silver. We also have a lot of, natural minerals and things like that. So we've got cities. A ton. And you'll hear a lot of stories about a lot of miners or families of miners, inmates who end up here. Lewiston at the time, 1860s, 1870s, Lewiston was bigger than Olympia, Washington, Seattle, Washington, and Portland, Oregon combined. Wow. Like huge. Yeah. Super massive because there's a ton of stuff to mine up there. So then in 1863, Idaho makes up the territory makes up the current day shape of Idaho, all of Montana, and all but the tiniest southwestern part of Wyoming. Then in 1864, Montana gets parceled off. So we have the shape of Idaho, and then part of Wyoming, we actually end up only keeping, other than that corner that already wasn't a part of Idaho, we only keep kind of a little bit above that. So most of Wyoming kind of is parceled off as well. And then in 1868, we get the current day shapes of Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming. Yeah. So that's kind of how we get our shape. I think Idaho, maybe I'm biased, but I think Idaho is like one of the cooler shapes of the states. It's pretty neat. Anyway, do you know how Idaho got its name?
I don't.
Okay.
How?
Yeah. So this is really, really interesting. No one actually knows. There's some speculation that it was a Shoshone word. Yeah. Idaho, some translation thinks it means like the sun comes up from the mountains or a gem of the mountains. But I was reading one of these resources and it says that like there isn't a word for gem in any sort of native language because gem is a very like white person thing.
Absolutely.
So the story is Congress they want to create a new territory in the Rocky Mountains. And there's this lobbyist named George M. Willing. And he says, listen, we should use this name Idaho. And it's from the Shoshone word. And this is what it means. And everyone was like, yeah, okay. They didn't actually create the territory of Idaho at that time. They created the Colorado Territory. And supposedly some people who were settling in Colorado wanted to get a claim on that name. So they settled at this place called Idaho Springs. Idaho Springs, Colorado. Because I've always thought that. I've like driven through there and I'm like, why is that called Idaho Springs? That's because supposedly people settled there. And ultimately it ends up that it wasn't even Willing who came up with this name. It was some of those miners who settled in Colorado who came up with this word. And so at the same time, then they create Idaho County in Washington Territory, and then that eventually gets parceled into Idaho. So it's just a made up name. Yeah. It's not, doesn't come from anything. It's not cool like Pennsylvania or Virginia or Washington, like just as a fake word. So that's
Idaho.
So if you were ever taught that Idaho was a native word, it is not. Yeah. It's just straight up made up. But we have to give credit to George M. Willing for being eccentric and just suggesting it. Cool. So it's kind of fun. All right. So as I said, mining was huge. It's really probably the main reason that the area got territorial status in the first place. You've got the gold rush in the Boise Basin, silver and gold in Silver City, gold, lead, silver, quartz up in Coeur d'Alene. And Coeur d'Alene was actually the largest producer of gold in the entire territory/state. It up to 80% of the total like numbers of gold came from Coeur d'Alene.
Yeah.
Like 80%.
Huge.
And then southern Idaho produced a lot more minerals rather than the precious metals, as I said. And all of this is how Idaho gets its nickname, which is
the Gem
the
State.
Gem State. So,
Woo.
okay, so Lewiston.
Wait, I thought it was the Potato State.
It is the potato. We love potatoes out here.
Yes,
but
yeah.
it's
That's
not
the next
officially
gem.
the potato state.
After all
I
the
know.
gems are taken up, now it's just
Which, if
yeah.
truly potatoes are a gem, you can do anything with them.
It's true.
I love them. It is because I'm from Idaho, but you can do anything with potatoes. Okay, so Lewiston was the territorial capital for only 3 years. Boise became an incorporated city in 1865 and became the territorial capital only a year later in 1866. Now, this is a big controversy.
Mm-hmm.
So as the gold rush kind of quiets down in northern Idaho, people are like, there's not as much up here as we thought. Everyone came real quick and like pulled everything out of the mountains. Like we don't have a lot left anymore. And so then this mineral rush, as I said, starts to happen in southwestern Idaho, centered in Idaho City. Mm-hmm. And so Idaho City becomes the largest city. Again, it overtakes Portland, Seattle. It's huge, still huge. And so there's a resolution in late 1864 to have the capital moved from Lewiston to Boise. That resolution is actually passed by the territorial legislature on December 7th, 1864, 6 weeks before the territorial legislature session actually legally began. So they did it really sketchy, like back room, like we're going to do this, we're going to pass it. So the motion to move the government to Boise was actually illegal. After litigation, only one vote separated the decision of the territorial Supreme Court. So they end up voting, I think, to say, like, is this illegal, is it not? Mm-hmm. And only one vote kind of separates this, like, I guess it was legal. I think I was kind of confused about that. But
yeah.
But basically, it's like really narrow margin.
It's very back room.
Yes. Because early Western people are not the most above board people. They will do whatever they want to do to get rich, to be lucrative. And I think this is the case in this situation. So the move to Boise is super unpopular in northern Idaho because they just lost their capital status. Have you been to Lewiston now? There's not a ton there. They have a factory that makes the entire town smell really gross.
Yeah, is that the Sensi or?
Wait. Whoa! Shots fired, Anthony. My goodness, I don't remember what factory it is, but like it's a really beautiful town. It's right on the river, but there is this factory that's like sort of smells everything up. So again, this move's super unpopular. And it is in violation of a court order. And the territorial governor, his name was Caleb Lyon, and the territorial secretary, they like know that this is unpopular and they're stuck in Lewiston. So they take the territorial seal, they take the territorial archives and the treasury, and they just flee from Lewiston like in the middle of the night. They come down into Boise. And they're trying to settle here, but Caleb Lyon is really outspoken, and he says, listen, I don't think Native Americans should be massacred. And everyone is like, what? Do you mean? Which is ridiculous. Yeah. And so because of this idea that Native Americans should not be massacred, he's dismissed as governor. So he kind of says like, well, screw you guys. And he takes all of the territory's Indian funds, a total of $46,000, and he takes off in the middle of the night. Just takes off with $46,000. Wow. So he doesn't want to massacre the Indians. He just wants to slowly starve them,
Profit.
So nice job, Caleb Lyon. You're top-notch character. Yeah. But anyway, so Boise ends up as the capital. Northern Idahoans are a little placated when the University of Idaho is given to Moscow. Mm-hmm. That's in 1889. And I've heard the story that Boise was given the choice between the university and the prison, and they chose the prison because they thought the prison would be more lucrative. So, and we'll get into that here in just a sec. Yes. And then you know the story of how Boise got its name, right?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay.
But go ahead.
Yes. So there's kind of two different versions of it. And they're both basically from French fur trappers. So the first one is that these French fur trappers, so Boise is kind of it is surrounded by desert. There's not anything out there. There's mountains on one side, desert on the other. And so, and it's not like pretty mountains. It's like the sagebrush and the, you know what I mean? So these French fur trappers are climbing over these mountains and they come to Boise and they see Boise from a ridge. And there's not a lot of trees out here, but because the river runs through Boise, there are more trees than what they were seeing out there. And so they come in and they're yelling, Le bois, which means the trees. And bois is spelled B-O-I-S, for those of you who don't speak French or know French. And then the other is that, again, it's mountain men. They named the Boise River La Rivière Boisée, Boisee. So basically it's French. And if you've noticed, we do say Boise. That is the correct way to pronounce it.
Yeah.
You can usually tell people who aren't from here because they'll say Boise, which
Boise.
I know it feels wrong saying it like that. So it is pronounced Boise. Yeah, the city of trees, which compared to most other places that have trees, there are not very many.
No, they're not.
But comparatively to the rest of Idaho, there are quite a few trees. So Boise, as the territory capital, was given the territorial prison instead of the university, and had the territorial prison for 18 years until Idaho became a state on July 3rd, 1890. And I always like to hold this over my Wyoming students' heads. Idaho became a state a week before Wyoming did. So, haha.
43rd state.
Yeah. So, Anthony, I have a little quiz for you.
Uh-oh.
Okay.
Oh, no.
Okay. You probably know all of these because you know everything.
I might just pause the recording if I don't look it up real fast.
Okay. So, I want to quiz you on the Idaho State emblems. See if you know these.
Are you kidding?
I'm not kidding. This will be fun. Okay, what is the Idaho State bird?
That is the blue jay. No?
Close. Mountain bluebird.
Mountain bluebird.
Yeah, there's blue in it.
I knew that.
Yeah. What is the state flower?
Syringa?
Yeah. Yeah, see? You're all, I don't know any of these.
Well,
you know all of
I had a
them.
coffee mug
Oh, you did?
growing up that had this.
Oh, so you just have to remember that mug.
I'm
for all of
picturing.
these.
I can see it. Yeah.
Okay, what is the state song?
Oh, here we have Idaho.
Yes. I don't even know what that sounds like. We should play it.
Here we have Idaho.
We'll just have Anthony sing it.
Do, 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 do. Sorry. I've played it before.
See,
and,
yeah. Okay. What is the state gem?
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Is it purple?
I think it might be bluish, but close to that color.
I can't think of it right now.
It is the star garnet.
Garnet. Okay,
garnet,
that's right.
yeah.
Is it garnet or garnet?
I don't know.
My piano teacher was,
Garnet.
oh, garnet. Star garnet. Yeah.
Garnet, whatever. Those are the same letters.
Okay.
What is the state tree?
Douglas fir?
A white pine.
White pine. That's
Close
right.
enough. Close enough. What is the state horse?
Is it the I'm thinking of the state fossil.
Yes, which is
The Hagerman horse.
Yes.
Is it a Palouse?
Appaloosa, yeah.
Appaloosa,
Yeah.
okay.
And that was actually the horse that I had on my 4th grade binder with Josephine. So the Hagerman horse, for those of you who don't know, it is actually one of the oldest species of equine. It was called the American zebra. Its head of it was actually striped like a zebra, but then the rest of its body, I think, was brown.
Oh.
Which I don't know how they know that.
Yeah.
But that's supposedly what it is. And it was discovered in Hagerman, Idaho in 1928. So that is our state fossil. What is the state dance? And this one is actually much more obvious than you would think.
The hustle? I'm not sure.
It's a square dance.
Square dance. I was going to say something about potatoes.
Yeah, like
in your
country,
pants or
just,
something. I don't know.
What is the state fish?
Ooh. I have no idea.
It is the cutthroat trout.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Uh-huh. And then lastly, what is the state insect?
Whoa. I have...
This-
Is it a moth?
No, but it's the monarch butterfly.
The butterfly.
So
okay, the
yeah. You
monarch.
were close.
Okay.
Like I could tell you were getting
I
there.
pictured it. I could see it on the cup.
That always threw me off because I was like, state insect, and you just don't think of
Right.
butterflies as insects, but they are.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and then you obviously know this, but for those of you listening, did you know that Idaho is the only state in the union that had a woman design their state seal?
Whoa.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Emma Edwards, it was that was who won this contest. There was a contest in 1891 to come up with a new state seal. And she actually, this is what women had to do back then. She actually entered just with her first initial. So she entered as E. Edwards. So they wouldn't be partial to choosing a woman. And so she won. And what's the Idaho phrase that's on the seal?
E pluribus. No,
That's United States.
Exist forever.
Esto perpetua. Let it be
perpetua.
perpetual.
Yeah.
So
is it let it or exist forever? Or
yeah,
something
or
like
exist,
that? Yeah.
or let it be, or
Let
I
it
don't
be.
know
Yeah,
what it is.
yeah.
But it's perpetual
I
is what
love
it
that.
is. So.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
So that is the brief. And again, if I got all of that wrong, then my apologies. If you
that's
want to know more about Idaho history, please go see our colleagues over at the Idaho State Museum.
Yes.
They just redid it.
It's amazing.
The museum that I went to when I was a kid, my parents also went to when they were kids. It was very old, very outdated, and what they've set up now is just absolutely incredible.
It's
like
amazing.
I went through it expecting to not have it be very much, but like I just had to walk through and not even look. There was so much stuff. So please go check them out. It is super awesome out there.
Please like and follow our Facebook page, Old Idaho Penitentiary. There you can connect with us directly by joining the Behind Gray Walls podcast group.
If you like the podcast, please consider making a donation. You can do that by going to store.history.idaho.gov/donation. Any donation is appreciated, and it will go toward improving the quality of this podcast and enabling us to continue to bring you the stories that we love and we hope that you love too. Anyway, all right, Anthony. So 1890, we become a state, but in 1863, we've got a territory, and we get the prison in 1872, correct?
Yes.
All right,
Yeah.
tell me about it.
But this whole thing kind of starts December 31st, 1868. The territorial legislator here in Boise is supposed to find land within the vicinity of this little Boise city, this tiny little city that's like 5 years old now. They're trying to find a place for a new prison. It's in Idaho City, and it's the one in Idaho City was made out of logs, and like there were full scale escapes. Like literally every inmate escapes. Yeah. This happened like every other month.
Have you been out to see that territorial prison out there?
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you haven't, if you go out to Idaho City, they do have. I mean, granted, I think it's like kind of been pulled apart, so I don't think that's what it looked like when inmates were staying there. But it is rudimentary at best.
It is, yeah. Like one of the escapes happened just before they moved everybody here in 1872 to this site that we're at right now. They gave a trustee, he was the cook, and I think he was in for grand larceny or something, but the guard on duty said he had to run to town, so he gave the keys to this trustee and said, lock everybody up and I'll be back. And, did he lock them up? No, he unlocked the doors and everybody escaped. The guard returned to see an empty prison. So anyway, it had issues. So the territorial government, they need to find a place for this new prison, and they have to decide, does the territorial government pay for the inmates, or does the United States, the federal government, pay for them? And so there's this whole debate. So December 31st, they're sent out to find a place so they can build an impenetrable cell house, essentially. And January 1st, 1869, the next day, they dropped the ball. They chose this land that we're on right now, but somebody from the city built a little shack and turned in some paper so that he owned the land. Oh, no. And so the Idaho Statesman, this writer writes, "We hardly thought it possible that a party resided in our midst so unprincipled as to attempt to speculate on a prison site to the detriment of not only the city but the whole territory. Vacate the spot. Disclaim any intention to speculate to the great injury of the citizens, and in the future sin no more against a people who patronize you, and peace may be restored."
Sin no more. That is...
It's, I mean, they were so mad because, like, the legislator, they were supposed to find this space for a while, and then when they finally do, it's too late because this guy, his name's Mr. Benedict, had settled it. Within the month, Mr. Benedict actually signs over the rights to the
He doesn't
territorial.
even get money for it?
No, he just gives it away for free,
man.
and he apologizes and says that he actually owned a lot of this land here in this eastern Boise area, like 40 acres. But his buddy told him that, I'm going to take that land right there if you don't. And so like that night he built that little shack, and he said it was not to get in front of the territorial government, but to get in front of his friend who he thought was going to take the land. So, he apologizes profusely and gives the land up, and it all it settles, and then they gather up the money, the funds, and they agree to have the federal government pay for the construction. So on April 2nd, 1870, a groundbreaking ceremony is held, and people from Boise all come out. And then on the 4th of July, in 1870, the 94th anniversary of American independence. This small celebration is held in downtown Boise, and citizens flock to watch this procession. That's like the local Fort Boise Military Reserve Band, all the little kids kind of like dancing around, and any of the citizenry that had carriages all rode from one end of town to the other, which is like 10 square blocks at this point.
Yeah.
And then they ended at this little field and had a big picnic and had this jolly celebration. They had an orator read the Declaration of Independence, and then they had the Fort Boise soldiers shoot 37 times, because at that point there are only 37 states in the Union.
Oh.
So yeah, it's like this huge thing. After all of this, at about 6 o'clock, everyone came from downtown Boise 2 miles along this dirt path to watch the laying of the cornerstone of the territorial prison. And prior to that, the statesmen, called for anyone to donate any documents relating to the early settlement of the territory. They said they wanted anything that included information about the town, mementos, and letters, so that future generations will know who and what their ancestors were. So, on our Independence Day, we celebrate the construction of a prison.
Yay! Let everyone be free except the criminals.
Exactly. So, this debate on, does the federal government pay to house inmates, or will the territorial government pay for this? This goes on the whole year. October 17th, they actually run out of money for construction, and the territorial government is just like, this is ridiculous. We need this to continue. So 2 days later, they put in funds so that it will be finished, and they finish it by December. So the prison's completed in December of 1870, but it would sit empty as the debate rages on some more on who pays for it. Finally, the federal government agrees to pay $7 a week, so $1 a day for each inmate that would serve here, and then pay for any guards or anything else. And then they would also, the president would hire a U.S. Marshal to oversee the prison. So that's what they do. So finally, after a whole year of all of this, March 21st, 1872, the first 11 inmates arrive from Idaho City. And they're shackled in a stagecoach, and there are 4 guards that follow it. The first 11 men are Ahud, who's serving 5 years for assault with intent to commit murder; Charles LeDuc, who's serving 2 years for grand larceny; Ong Gao, 4 years for manslaughter; Dennis Crowley, 15 years for second-degree murder; Jacob Duke, 4 years for assault with intent to kill; Mike Donahue, 4 years for assault with intent to kill; Al Priest and John Black, 15 years for highway robbery; John Thomas, 18 months for grand larceny; Shock, who's serving 6 years for manslaughter; and then William Scott, 3 years for grand larceny. So those are the first 11.
And I do want to say, and I didn't put this in my outline, but you probably heard a lot of like Asian sounding names, and that probably seems strange because Idaho is not well known for its Asian population. Yeah. But the railroads, as they were being built, when it was being built across the country, it didn't come through Idaho. Idaho does obviously have railroads, but not the big continental one. And a lot of Chinese immigrants would actually work on this railroad, but when it was finished, they didn't have anywhere to go. Yeah. And since Idaho, especially the Boise area, had a lot of mining to do, they came out to mine. And so Boise actually got a pretty substantial Chinese population. Absolutely. And I'm sure you know this because you know everything, but Chinden, the word Chinden, that road is named, it's a conglomeration of Chinese garden, because that's where all the Chinese lived, was down there in Garden City. Yeah. Again, my dad tells me all of this stuff because, we're big nerds. But anyway, back to you. Yeah, so this territorial prison, it actually had 42 cells. Really could only hold 40 men at a time. One cell was basically a kitchen, and one was turned into a kind of a restroom area. So 40 men, and in this early system, there was a move from the Pennsylvania to the Auburn system, and the Pennsylvania system is all about penitence. Where we get the word penitentiary, basically you're sitting in solitary confinement so you can foster some sort of penitence about your crimes and your sins, and encourage your own reformation so you don't sin again. Auburn system, this is basically, let's put you to work all day, and then at night you're in solitary confinement. This would be basically what this prison was run as. But within the first month of this institution opening up, we have our first escapes.
Yeah, we've got Hood, who is serving 5 years for assault with intent to commit murder. He and this fella named Al Priest, who's in here for the highway robbery, Al Priest is sentenced to 15 years. And Al is just outside the cell walls. And anytime you were outside of the main prison, you were wearing a ball and chain, a shackle with a ball and chain on it, like 20-pound piece of iron strapped to your ankle.
Yep.
And Al is stacking some rock, and he asks the guard if he can go in and get a sip of water. So the guard's like, yeah, go ahead, Al. So he goes back into the cell house. He goes to that one little kitchen cell, and he reaches into his pocket, pulls out a pair of keys, unshackles his ankle, and he actually climbed up and out the window. And he squeezed through. There's a little area where the bars weren't very close together, so he squeezed out of that and started running through the foothills. The rest of the inmates were actually all on duty digging a ditch around the corner. So guards didn't realize, they're watching these other men. Finally, one of the guards checks inside, sees the windows open, there's the shackle on the ground. They grab the men, toss them in their cells. They hop on their horses and start chasing this dust cloud that is Al Priest running through the foothills. They forgot to lock one cell, though. They forgot to lock Hood's cell, and he slides his cell open, looks around. He sees the ball and chain on the ground with the key still in it. Pulls that out, unshackles his ankle, climbs up and out the same window, and heads towards Boise in the opposite direction, and is never seen or heard from ever again.
Oof.
Originally, they actually said that a fellow named An Gao escaped. They didn't even get the correct Chinese inmate. But they actually talked about the idea that they didn't even think that Hood was even guilty of the crime that he was brought in here for. Okay. So, Al Priest, he makes it out. Uh-huh. And, there are so many little ravines and caves and different places he could hide in the foothills over here. I mean, if you ever hike up there, you can see all the different little nooks and crannies. Yeah. But not long after, the U.S. Marshals sent after him, and Robbins, there's a Robbins Street here in Boise right next to the cemetery over here on Warm Springs, named after this deputy who, was super renowned. We should do a story about him because, how he chased so many men down. And, oh, man, he was such a cool sheriff back in the day. Anyway, they both look for him. They don't find him. Finally, this fella discovers him. Reinierson was his name. He sees that a couple of his horses are gone, so he starts to track it, and he follows Al Priest way out towards Rock Creek. And apparently he was about 25 miles away, and he looked at him through a looking glass and started following him. But he was kind of hiding underneath this ridge. So he slowly approached Al, and then, let's see, this is how they describe it. Reinierson rushed ahead and stayed just out of sight of Priest until he was able to get close enough, and quicker than thought, his pursuer was dismounted with his Henry rifle leveled, and the crack of the gun was so quick that he was hit in the forehead, over the right eye, just under the hat, the ball coming out on the backside through the hat, just above the rim. Priest instantly fell from his horse dead, and the body was not disturbed by the pursuers. They took the horses and saddles, returned to Rock Creek.
No way, they didn't even take his body
there. Yeah, they said they didn't have shovels. And then the next day, another guy came out. He saw the body. He also didn't have a shovel, so he returned. And then, 2 days later, Al is buried where he fell from his horse.
Yikes.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is like one of those crazy stories. Do you think that Reinierson was charged or anything?
No, of course not.
Of course
he
not.
He was pursuing a fugitive.
Exactly. And he was protecting his own property. Yeah. This was kind of the Wild West, I mean, well, it was.
Kind of.
Yeah, absolutely.
It was.
The escapes didn't stop with this new institution. They found that there were still a lot of weak points. They didn't even have a fence for the first 5 years. It wasn't until 1877 that they finally put this 12-foot fence, and there are turrets on each corner with armed guards in them. But inmates still figured out ways to escape. One of my favorites was sometime in I think it was 79 or early 80s, these guys had a little chicken coop right up against the fence. And every day they were putting water on the fence to weaken it and get it moldy and nasty. And then one day during the lunch hour, they kicked through the fence and 3 of them escaped and, eventually recaptured. But I mean, it's very fun.
Yeah.
So 1878, we have our first hanging at this site. This young Bannock murderer named Tom Biago, and he lived at Fort Hall Reservation in southeast or kind of eastern Idaho. he thought that his brother was unlawfully, locked up and given a huge sentence out here at the institution. And so, he was upset, and there was a lot going on in the state at this point. Up in North Idaho, there's a new reservation, and the Nez Perce are being pushed into one area, and so the tempers are flaring, and this is happening all across the country between white settlers and Native Americans. But Tom Biago decides to kill the first white man he comes across, and he comes across this young rancher named Roden, and he ends up picking up his rival and shooting and killing him. He's arrested soon after and brought out here, sentenced to hang. He felt his arrest was also unlawful, of course. While locked up, he was interviewed and asked why he was hostile. And he said that it was owing to the discontent of the Indians with their agent at Fort Hall and with the Graybeard, meaning his missionary, who had been sent there to teach them the Camas Prairie, he said, belonged right to the Indians, and they needed it. His hanging was the only one that the public was actually invited to. So there's this huge myth that, people from Boise would sit on the foothills and watch the hangings.
Thanks a lot, Ghost Adventures.
Yes, that did not happen.
Didn't happen.
There were people who were invited. Those were like sheriffs and, prosecuting attorneys and detectives, things like that. But for Tom Biago's execution, nearly 250 citizens came out to the territorial prison to watch his hanging, and it was pouring downpour of rain, and all these people came out to witness this. So this kind of shows the issues that were going on between the native and the white settlers. This is a quote from the Statesman about Tom Biago. He says, when he saw that the people were assembling in and near the prison, he asked what it meant. And when told that it was near the hour of his execution, he said, "Me no die today. Tomorrow die all right. One sleep more, then die with a good heart." He was placed in his cell until the hour, hoping that the chief and his brothers would arrive at to save him. He walked to the gallows without issue and took a calm glance at the crowd and the surrounding objects, and indulged in a grim and somewhat ghastly smile at this scene.
Oh boy. Okay, so listen.
Yes.
Early Idaho Statesman, we love the Idaho Statesman now, but early newspaper reporters did not give a hang about reporting things fairly.
Absolutely.
And so there is so much racism about pretty much anyone but white people.
Yes.
We have found articles on, I think, almost every ethnicity, every race that in some way disparages them. And as you heard, they quote him in this supposedly broken English. They do one very similar with some Chinese inmates as well. It is very, very difficult to hear. And please just know that if we say something like that is not us.
It is.
We are
It is a direct
directly
quote.
quoting.
Yes, just to show kind of the sentiment of the time. Like this quote is a direct piece of that time period, and oh my gosh. He's our first hanging here at the site. There would be 9 others. The next one wouldn't happen until 1901, so post-statehood. And that's when, Boise becomes the official, the prison becomes the official site for all hangings. There were other hangings in different towns, and most of those were either lynch mob, individual kills somebody that's prominent in the city.
Vigilante justice.
Exactly, yeah. But most of the hangings after that were done at a county level until 1901 when they were done here. Okay. So that's 1870s. That's the just establishment of this site and what would come. 1880s. There's a fella named Fred T. Dubois, and he is running for governor of Idaho, and he's running on the anti-Mormon ticket. Yay! And he knows that Mormons in southeast Idaho tend to vote Democratic. They're a huge block of voters that will not vote for him. And so he devises a new law to make it illegal for Mormons to vote. Yeah. Yes. So there are 2 laws. There's the polygamy law, which is a felony, and that's having several wives, several marriage partners, typically wives, and that was a felony, up to $500 fine, and a prison term not to exceed 5 years. Well, Dubois creates a new law called unlawful cohabitation, which is a misdemeanor, comes with a $300 fine and a prison term not to exceed 6 months.
So can you
Unlawful-
explain? I was going to say, can you explain what unlawful cohabitation is?
That is when a married couple has other women living with them, like adult women. So if there's any speculation, because, there's no official state record that this man has all of these wives,
Right.
that would just be within the church. But a sheriff can approach a house, and if he sees adult women living there, he can consider that unlawful cohabitation.
And that's what, because do we have any inmates who come in for polygamy?
We do.
Like,
we
not
had
very
a
many,
couple.
though, right?
Yeah, and actually those were much later.
And
Yeah.
that's because, so just to be upfront, I am LDS, and so I will often chime in on these LDS inmates. So polygamy, the LDS Church did practice this in this time period, but again, it's not legal. They're not legally married to these wives. They're married within what we call the covenant of the church, and so that's why they can't get a ton of people on polygamy, because there isn't any legal record of them being married to more than one person, which today is also called bigamy. We do have some people who come in on bigamy charges.
Yeah, and Lincoln actually created the bigamy laws in the 1860s.
So that's why I think this Dubois instituted this unlawful cohabitation, because then you're able to get a lot more of these people that he does not like into jail, where then he has a better chance of winning that vote. Also, I do want to say that the Democrats and the Republicans have switched parties since this. So when you say that a lot of Mormons voted Democrat, that is absolutely not the case anymore. But they actually remain along those same kind of party lines. It's just the names have basically been switched.
So between 1885 and 1890, there would be 48 Mormon men from southeastern Idaho convicted, 47 for unlawful cohabitation, all punished with a maximum $300 fine and between 3 to 6 month sentences, and one for resisting an officer for concealing a polygamous friend. And he was fined $300 and given a year sentence. So because he was protecting his friends, he was given a longer sentence, and he had to pay his $100 court fees. This means 48 men. This original territorial cell house, how many did it hold?
40.
Yeah. So that means
So that's not even counting people who were coming in for other stuff.
Exactly. So this place is packed. It is packed. And we actually, fortunately, a lot of these men were avid writers and journalists. So we have a couple writers. One guy named Nash, he wrote, "We found Mr. Dubois to be a generous-hearted gentleman. He gave us a free ride on the UNR to Pocatello. The sidewalks were crowded with men of all ages and descriptions, watching for a sight of the distinguished guest." This is kind of tongue-in-cheek.
Yeah, for sure.
But he would describe, he wrote this great poem. I didn't include that, but he would say, "I feel first rate and contented with my lot, knowing I am here for keeping the commandments of God, and that in the end, if I prove faithful through the trials of my life, I will gain life eternal in the kingdom of God."
All very LDS language.
Yeah.
That we still use today.
But he still held this, and we can see that in Alexander Nephi Stevens, who also left this great journal, which is like from the late 1880s. So it really gives us a picture of what day-to-day life in that territorial prison was like. He says on November 21st, 1887, it's riddled full
Yeah, he doesn't
of,
use punctuation.
Yeah, and a lot of misspelled words. So let me stumble through this. On the 21st, we stayed in our cells most all day. We went out about an hour and a half. Among the prisoners, they had an old fiddle. We played a few times for them. There was 3 of us, could play a little, Brother Wilson and Brother Anderson and myself. We cheered them up as well we could, and they said it was a change. We then went back to our cells, spent the rest of the day in reading and sitting around. We couldn't get much exercise in our cell. It's about 6 feet by 10 feet. So, yeah, kind of an idea of what those days are like. And these are, how many men do you think they had packed in these cells?
Right.
Wow.
Yeah, well, and also in the fact that he mentions 2 other men by brother, which is a very LDS way of identifying other members of the church. So that means that he's in there with people he knows.
Yes.
And so that, again, that goes back to this idea that we know that they are targeting LDS members.
Yeah. And because, these guys were so lawful and so kind, the guards had actually let them stay out in the yard much longer.
Okay.
And gave them like trustee status. They were kind of the original trustees, a lot of these fellas. So
And what is a trustee?
a trustee is an inmate who they're given extra privileges. So they get to sleep sometimes outside the walls. We'll see that later on. They get to run different departments and kind of oversee other inmates in whatever work it is. And sometimes they're sent on work release, so they get to go into town and do other things. Yeah.
Sweet.
Yeah. So that is kind of our territorial prison. They realize that it's packed. They decide to get some money to construct a new cell house. So 1889, there's some money allotted, and they construct the 1890s cell house, which we still call New Cell House, even though it's so old now. And it was basically a mirror of that first cell house. But it included a little side area, which would later house women for a short time, in a little segregated off room, and it had little guard areas and a little barber shop area. But neither of these cell houses have any sort of plumbing. That will come much, much later. So finally, they realize, okay, we've got 2 cell houses now. This is 1890. We still have this big wooden fence that people keep escaping from. Let's improve that. So 1893, they start construction on this new wall, and that would take about 1.5 years to complete. And they included the giant turrets, which we still see today. And the wall was 16 to 18 feet high, kind of depending on where you look at it, and about 2 feet wide. And
it doesn't go underground, right? Doesn't go that deep underground.
Not that deep. No, just a couple feet. Yeah. And they would just break chunks of the fence down as they constructed it. Finally, it's finished in 1894, and they included their first big sally port, that was our entrance. That's the entrance if you come to the old pen today. That's what you walk through. That was the first entrance for carriages in those days, and later on motorized vehicles and things. And the warden and his family originally lived on the upstairs rooms.
And the inmates constructed all of these, correct?
Yes,
all these buildings themselves on the walls?
Exactly. All in that Auburn style. It's all constructed by convict labor. You were sentenced to hard labor at this institution, and the 1890s would have been rough. I've done quite a bit of research. There's one guy who was I think he was in for murder. It's been a while since I looked at his file, but he was like one of the best fellas working in the quarry, and so he was training other inmates how to do it, and he ended up injuring himself. And if you look at one of the capstones in the west wall, it's kind of behind what is now Four House, you can see his name written up there. So they kind of immortalized him. Nice. They finished the wall, and then they decide they want to construct a new dining hall. So in 1895, this inmate named George Hamilton, this is an alias, and we're going to have to do a big deep dive into George's story sometime, but he's brought out here for this robbery of the shepherd with a buddy of his, and the warden called him a draftsman. He had studied architecture, and so warden asked, would you design a dining hall? And George is like, sure, I'm educated, I can do that. And he's put to work. He designs it. He oversees its construction. And if you compare the construction of that building to the territorial prison in the 1890s cell house, the rows were immaculate. This was an amazing building. And at this point, there was a sign above the front door of the admin building that said 25-cent admission. So people were, flocking out to come and shake George's hand and admire this building. There was basically 2 tiers, and there's a little tiny attic space for a guard to oversee this little dining area. There's a guard dining area. There's a big kitchen, and there was basement compartments, blacksmith shop, carpentry shop, a little church area, and a plunge bath in the back left corner, because prior to that, they had a trough that they would fill up basically once a week, and everybody would get to share some of that water. So
Yay.
Great bath time. Nice thick water for the last couple of
water.
hours. Yeah.
Ugh.
I mean, they're all working in the quarry, so they're covered in soot and dynamite and everything else. So so George is released early, about 2 months early before his sentence would have been up, and he actually returns to his original vice that brought him here, to alcohol. And he tells a guard before he leaves, if I can't control my vice, if this drink has control of me, I'm going to end it all. And sure enough, he does that. He buys some morphine and overdoses that night. This is 1898, and this is one of those stories that we still see in the news every single day. People returning to their old vices as soon as they leave prison.
Yep.
So, next year, 1899, more money is allotted for construction of new cell houses because this place is, again, overpopulated. And 2 and 3 house construction begins. They actually finish number 3 house first in 1909. But the warden at that time, it had been about, in that 10 years, I think there are 10 wardens. So like a warden a year. And he walks in and he takes a little metal spike and he chips away.
Because he notices, right, that the doors are just sort of hammered into the rock. It's not they're not sliding cells.
Yeah.
They're swinging
and it's not
doors.
metal cells. It's all made with sandstone.
Oh.
And so he
I didn't realize
uses,
that.
he just chisels the rock until the door falls off its hinges. He says, what'd you do for the last 10 years? This is a total waste. And so he says, no, this is not going to work. And he has the stone removed, and they construct a barn along the east wall of the prison. And then they use those grounds to assemble the cell house across from it, 2 house. And that's finished in 2 years in 1911. And that cell house can hold 160 men. Still no plumbing in there. So that cell house, it would be used until the late 1960s. And if you go in, like that's what the territorial prison and 1890 cell house, that's what the inside looked like. But there are 4 tiers instead of just the 3.
Because the bars, if you go inside 2 house, you'll see that those bars look very different. But that was just sort of the style of
that
bars
was the style,
early years.
exactly.
And so eventually it does change to the up and down bars that we tend to think of. But these ones are latched.
Yes.
So please come visit and see that.
Yeah. And I mean, even in the 30s, 20 years after this cell house is constructed, visitors came out and they were like, there's no way that this is humane because of the smells. Like they had geothermal heat in there too. So during the winter, it's
smelled like
fairly
sulfur.
warm. Yeah, but it's sulfur and just humid. And they don't have flushing toilets or sinks. They have buckets for both of those things. They have honey buckets. That's what they call their toilets. So 80 of these honey buckets just waste sitting there from about 5 p.m. in the evening until 7:30 in the morning. Yuck. I'm surprised more people didn't get sick.
I cannot tell you how grateful I am for indoor plumbing.
Yes.
Because I would assume everyone listening to this podcast has grown up with indoor plumbing. I cannot imagine not having. I have to go camping for like 2 days, and I'm like, what do you mean I have to use an outhouse? I'm not using an outhouse.
Yeah.
And to just like, anyway.
Yes.
Ugh.
It would have been rough. And I bet a lot of people, it was a good thing it was a great deterrent to like, whoa, I'm not going back there again. So the shell of 3 house, that sits vacant. And one of our most famous inmates, Harry Orchard, he is actually put in charge of a shoe factory. And he ends up actually buying all the equipment and starts to teach other inmates. He becomes kind of a head of this factory that manufactured shoes that went all the way to St. Anthony, to the industrial schools, and to the insane asylum, which would later become Idaho State Hospital South and
Blackfoot.
North. Yeah, that is huge. But Harry actually comes in 1905, and Idaho's trial of the century is 1908. I kind of skipped over that. We'll get to Harry Orchard in probably a 2 or 3 part episode.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. 1920s, there is a new movement towards having convict labor to create goods. And in 1923, a shirt factory begins to be constructed. And by October, it's completed, and inmates are taught to make shirts. They aren't allowed to make hobby crafts or anything else like that. They essentially work for 8 hours a day and make like I think a dime a day or something for all the shirts. There would be 200 men, and they could make 220 shirts a day. That's 2,640 shirts made in a single day by these 200 men. And they weren't allowed to do anything else. Like everything else was put on suspension. And this went on from 1923 until 1933. There's the Haas-Cooper Act is enacted in Congress, and they say basically it's illegal to sell convict-made goods. The Great Depression, is raging, and there's no way that prisoners should be competing with these free men who are just dying out there trying to make money. So that all ends in 33, But the prison purchases 200 acres of land out at Eagle Island, which becomes the new place for inmate labor.
Which I really did not know that Eagle Island. I mean, I've only been out there a few times, but I really didn't know that that was prison land. But everyone who comes in knows already. So nice job,
I used
everyone,
to go
for
swimming
knowing.
there a lot as a kid.
Yeah.
Oh, so yeah, I had no idea until I started working here.
Yeah.
Wow. And they would grow and raise so much food and cattle, and you know they had a canning plant back here at this site. So you know whatever food they didn't cook and or send to these different state institutions, they would can and preserve all winter long. And so this prison became completely self-sustaining, especially after the purchase of Eagle Island. So that's in 1933. That all starts. 1942, that territorial prison, everything is gutted. Everything's taken out, and it's converted into a chapel. This just big room. They have pews. And over the next 20 years, inmates would be sent in there. Our most famous one is James Arrard. Blue Eagle was his name. And he would paint murals along the wall. And one of my favorite quotes is from an oral history that said it's this inmate talking about how beautiful the murals are. And there was this mural of Jesus, and the eyes were drawn so well that it looked like he was following you around the room.
Interesting.
Which just, I mean, and I've
cool.
looked at the photos that we have from these murals. They are something. Sad that we'll get to what happened to them. Yeah. The 1943, a laundry room is installed in that shirt factory building. They make an extra little section, and that's inmates would later do laundry for Gowan Field and the Mount Holm Air Force Base, and they also inserted their tailor shop in there. So, you know, inmates, they're raising their own food, they're quarrying all this stone, they're doing their own plumbing work, electrical work, and they're tailoring their own clothes, they're making their own shoes, everything. I mean, this prison was a city behind walls, and whatever you need out in the regular population, you need behind these walls. You need barbers and everything else. So somebody had a task, and if you didn't want to work, you could sit in your cell all day long, and the administration was fine with that. That was up to you.
Yikes.
Yeah. 1947, they start making license plates, and they would actually average making about 5,000 plates a day. That was put into the shirt factory building, and then the next year, 1948, 2 Yard is created, and they would build these two big warehouse buildings. One had education areas, and one was like vocational training. They would teach automotive repair and refrigeration repair and all these things. They also had their big baseball diamond out there.
Yay.
Yeah,
The
Outlaws, which you know they're a team from the 1900s, you know, onwards. It's and it didn't matter what crime you committed. If you wanted to play on the baseball team on the Outlaws, you could do it. And these guys were good.
They were good. And a lot of
Yeah.
times there were inmates who played baseball before they even came in. And so they would come in and just rule the roost, basically. Yeah, I mean, and I think we talk a lot about the Outlaws, but it is important to know that there were other sports teams as well. Like the prison had a softball team and a basketball team. And so the inmates, they didn't have to just play baseball. They could play handball. We have pictures of inmates playing handball on the back of Forehouse. I don't even know how to play handball.
Boxing.
Yes.
And they held Golden Gloves tournaments here in the 70s, and they would travel to Pocatello until an inmate escaped.
And that's, I was going to say, and they used to play baseball outside the walls as well, right? They would go, like, they would do like a home and an away series until some inmates decided to escape, and then they're like, guess we'll just have them here then.
I was just going through some old newspapers from the 20s, and there was this outlaw game, and it was at Julia Davis Park, and the statesman made such a to-do about Harry Orchard, this assassin who killed, you know, over 30 people, and Lyda Southard being sent from the prison to go sit in the stands and watch this game. I mean, people flocked to watch the Outlaws played, which is just amazing. And they would play like BSU, the local university, and they would usually win. They were really good. The Idaho Statesman, we'll have to talk about that sometime with Amber, with our site administrator. She is a baseball fanatic.
She is.
And she gave a huge presentation about the Outlaws a couple of years ago for the city of Boise. And she always talks about the Idaho Statesman actually sponsored the Outlaws baseball team one year and wrote all these articles about the players and, you know, how important baseball was to their rehabilitation and everything else. So it was a good, important part of this history. So 2 yards created. It's this big rec yard, essentially. They had a basketball court in there and weightlifting equipment and things
And a
like
football
that. as
field
well.
too, right?
And a football field, yeah. So, and there were two, which are still there now, these two big guard towers, and the guards would be in there, whenever inmates were in the yard.
Yeah, so for those of you who aren't aware, if you go to the botanical gardens, that was 2 yards.
Yeah.
And so you'll see those guard towers in there, and that's because that was sort of the boundary of 2 yard.
Yeah.
And then if you go to concerts in the summer out in the botanical gardens, they're called the Outlaw Field Concert Series because you were sitting where they used to play baseball.
Exactly.
Which I love. I'm such a nerd. It's so fun.
Oh, I saw Neil Young last year.
Oh man,
That
because
was so
Sheryl Crow
fun.
came last year
Oh,
too.
yeah.
Like we've been getting some good names. The Allman Brothers came before
Yeah.
Greg Allman died recently.
Man,
Yeah, we got some good stuff.
definitely. Yeah, it's fun to be here like in the morning because they do all their sound
check,
checks.
yeah.
Yeah, so sometimes if you're getting a tour, you'll hear music. That's some awesome famous band
Just sound
just
checking.
warming up,
No
tuning
worries.
their guitars.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's so cool. So, 1950, there's a new resurgence for construction, and that's they start construction on what we call Four House, which is this 4-tier cell house that could hold 320 men. 4 men per cell. Since 1928, they have plumbing in the cell houses now, and 4-man cells. If you've been in here, it's easy to look at those and go, oh, wow, these are pretty spacious compared to these other cell houses. But you have to just imagine 3 other bodies in there with you and how hard that would truly be. Year after 4 House is completed, maximum security 5 House is constructed. And with that building, they construct the first permanent gallows. Prior to that, there were 9 executions, and all were done with this temporary set of timber that they had in an old shed. And every couple of years, they'd pull that out and erect this gallows and hang somebody. The death row cells before the 5 House was constructed were actually an 1890s cell house down on the ground level facing the Rose Garden.
Where the executions took place.
Exactly. So the men who were condemned to die, they would actually watch from their cell out into the Rose Garden through the window there, seeing the gallows being constructed prior to their execution. These gallows in 5 House would only be used once in 1957 for a fella named Raymond Snowden. So that's the last construction at this site, 5 House. The 60s, there's a new penology is going through this whole thing about rehabilitation and using all these different methods through psychology, therapy, everything else, how to reform these individuals' actions and minds and give them education so that when they leave, they aren't just, quarrying stone and things. They can actually get jobs in the real world. So the 60s is a huge era for reform. Lots of help for these guys out here. Then, let's say, 68, a new warden named Raymond May. Oh, my gosh.
We're stuck on Snowden.
Yeah, exactly.
Raymond
May.
Warden Raymond Snowden. Surprise.
He had actually been a correctional officer at Alcatraz. That is the prison for prisoners that are so bad, that they need a worse prison than
literal
anything
island.
else. Exactly. And so he had worked there. He had worked at McNeil Island Federal Penitentiary. So he tries to enact a new federal prison, and Idaho hires him to create this new system of corrections, of correcting your path. And so he helps choose this site, ironically, on Pleasant Valley Road, about 16 miles south, and construction begins. So they're shipping out all these trustees to build the new prison, just like they did out here, constructing all these cell houses. Back to that time capsule. Remember 1870, 4th of July? They put this time capsule in the ground. 1970, Warden May, he actually asked an inmate to write a history of the institution. And so as this inmate's digging, he's like, hey, one of these old cell houses has a time capsule. They don't know which is the oldest cell house at this time.
Oh, wow.
Which is an amazing thing to think about.
That is interesting.
Right? Yeah.
How
but
would
I
you
mean,
not
it's
know that?
Because they are
I guess
it's an active prison. They are historians. They are thinking of it that way. Yeah.
And I guess you just come in as a new warden and you just know what buildings are what. And
Right,
you
yeah.
don't know which is, that's so
Yeah, so
interesting.
they take a metal detector and walk around the 1890 cell house. Nothing. They go around the chapel and they get this ping right in the corner. And this is about July 7th. It's a few days after. They were a couple
were a
days
little
late.
late.
But Raymond May, Captain Joseph Munch, which is someone who's a huge character here that we'll talk about from the 60s, and several inmates, they actually pull the cornerstone out of the ground, and the governor comes and the mayor comes. They all come to watch the unveiling of this, and they break open this box and pull out all these things. They had the original jewels of Boise, Masonic Lodge, a great seal of the territory of Idaho, all these vintage coins from 1866, 67, 69, bills ranging from 5 cents to 25 cents, a box of quartz samples, a packet of gold dust, a list of officers of Idaho Lodge number 1, Masons. There were a lot of Masons in early history here. Stage line tickets from Boise to Sacramento, Chinese documents and money, postmark envelopes, 2 regular Democratic tickets, 2 tickets to a German society inauguration, a coupon for 1 loaf of bread from the Idaho Bakery, a Pacific Coast Almanac, a yearbook of facts from 1870, an 1870 World Almanac, several newspaper publications from the Cincinnati Daily Gazette, San Francisco Chronicle, and the Boise Semi-Weekly News. So after all these are taken out, the Idaho State Historical Society actually is like, we'll take these and we'll put them on display. So they created this exhibit called A Corner of History, which I would love to bring back sometime.
Yes.
And it was described as one of the most important caches to come to light in many years. Unfortunately, a lot of the objects disappeared, and Captain Joseph Munch,
after they've been on display.
After they went on display, yeah. And Joseph Munch actually accused the former governor Samuelson of stealing them.
Oh,
yeah. So
snap!
This is all contention. We don't know actually what happened, but Captain Munch insists that it was Samuelson. Kind of an interesting little thing imagining.
Yeah. I do want to say we do have some of the greatest named governors of all time.
Yeah.
We have the first Jewish governor, Moses Alexander. But my absolute favorite, Barzilla J. Clark.
Barzilla. It's so good.
Amazing.
Yeah. We've got such cool history.
Oh, man. Anyway, sorry.
Okay. I'm coming to the end of the institution.
Oh, finally. Just kidding, Anthony. You're doing great.
In August 10th, 1971, there is a prison riot. And it's like a 110-degree day. A lot of these cell houses, their air conditioning is not very adequate. So, I mean, that was the spark. There were a lot of things that were going on. Inmates were saying that, there were inmates that were working in the dining hall that had diseases that would be communicable, and that there were rats and rat manure in their fresh water basin.
Oh, man.
Also, Raymond May had created what guards and inmates would call the honor dorm. Basically, he turned Five House into this place for all the long-term lifers, as you'd call them, to be housed separately from the rest of the prison population, because they wanted these young kids to be away from these old-timers who were these long-time, they're life criminals and things. Well, they basically gave them free reign in maximum security in Five House to run this site. And so 2 tunnels were discovered. And after the second tunnel was discovered, Ray returned these guys into the rest of the population. And this is all happening on these super blistering hot days. And that is what sets off the spark. Inmates end up looting the hospital and shooting up the drugs and doing all this stuff. And after it takes about a week for this riot to quell, and we'll get into full detail and all the characters involved in it in some episode, but at the end of it, one inmate is missing, and they actually thought that possibly it was a ruse, that he had, maybe he created this whole thing so that he could escape. His name is Bill Butler, and he's serving a 75-year sentence for murder in the first degree. And he's also the head of the Table Rock JCs, which is like the club for anybody who wants to get out of this prison and make connections with the outside world and, hobnob with some of the top people in Boise. Well, they find him actually rolled up in a gym mat, bludgeoned and stabbed to death. So that's the 71 riot. Yeah. Guards, it takes a while for them to feel comfortable to re-enter the yard. That's not the last one, though. 1973 in March, a final riot occurs. And this one is also, it's all these different conditions. The new prison site is almost done. Half the population is over there. There aren't enough guards back at this site to serve everybody. There aren't enough guards at the new site to serve everybody. There are fires going on. All these things are happening here. And one inmate who we'll get into, his name is Larry Trujillo. He returns to the site all beaten up. That's what he appears to be. We would later find out that most of it was self-induced so that he could return to the site. But his half-brother spots him and says, look at what they're going to do to us at the new prison site. That riles everybody up. Well, by everybody, I mean about
I was going to say it wasn't very many people because everyone wanted to not have anything to do with it, right? Because they were like, they knew they were going to be transferred out. You don't want to get in a bunch of trouble. So most people just sort of like stood around and let them do it, right?
Yeah, they actually went into the deadline area, the sandy area near the wall. And that's where guards are saying, if you're not involved, come over here. And then everybody else, they looted the commissary. And there's a great photo of one inmate with a cat on his shoulder. It's kind of cute. Yeah. Anyway, so that riot, they end up torching the dining hall. The flames leap over and catch the chapel on fire. And a lot of the inmates talk about how much they regret that chapel burning down because of these beautiful murals and everything else, how special it was to them.
They did save the prison piano, though, which we have on display here, right?
We do, yeah, in our admin building, in the where you can watch a video about the history and see photos and not just listen to my voice talk about it, or you're a tour guide, you can see it. There's the piano right there next to the screen. So that riot ends, and it does not get the men out of here any sooner. They are shipped out on December 3rd, 1973. National Guard is called out. They have helicopters. All these men are in the back of these Army vehicles, shackled, and they're all brought about 16 miles south to Pleasant Valley Road to where the current prison resides. And the site basically sat vacant for about a year as the Historical Society transferred ownership. And if you see, there are these signs that say, warning, guard dogs on duty. Those weren't from when the prison was active. That was actually from the Historical Society actually having to hire guard dogs to prevent people who were jumping the wall and looting and doing all this stuff. Yeah, so those it's kind of a historiography of this site. You know, it's the history of our history here of the Historical Society trying to prevent any damage happening here. So finally we opened as a tourist destination on December 14th, 1974. And we still, every year, offer that day as $1 admission. So if you can't afford to come out, or if you just want to come do something in December, come tour the site. It's $1 on December 14th. Wow.
Oh, boy.
Wow, was that enough?
I think you did great. I'm worried that people won't come visit now because they know everything.
Gosh,
no, just kidding. No, there's so much to know. Yeah, there's so much to know. And
seriously,
your tour guides, if you come and you take a guided tour, you'll still find out plenty.
Yes, yeah. This is seriously just an introduction to
we've hit 150
few years, 155 years. I mean, plus the thousands before that.
Of course.
Yeah, I didn't even talk about Lake Idaho and where the sandstone came from or anything.
We don't have time. Do you mind if I get into the women's history real quick?
No,
I'll be quick.
And I skipped that again. Yes, please do.
No, yeah. Well, I figured you skipped it because you knew I was doing it.
Good. Yes, I did.
That's exactly what happened, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so I'll be quick just because my project right now is working on the female prisoners, and we're hopefully going to publish a book about the female inmates for Idaho Women 100, which is the celebration of the 100th anniversary of women in the United States getting the right to vote. Idaho did get it earlier; they got it in 1896. But so that's my project right now. So I'm really, really into the women, and so every episode I will be talking about a female inmate. So I just want to go over the history of the women and the women's ward. It's a little bit different than the men. A majority of the stuff that you learn when you come here is going to be about the men and the way of life for men. We only had 217 women, whereas we had about 13,000 male inmates. So just a tiny, tiny portion, but that doesn't mean that they don't deserve a little bit of attention. So the very first woman came in 1887. Her name was Henneby. She was from Fort Hall, Native American reservation. There weren't any separate accommodations for women, and so she was just kept in the territorial prison with the men. She did get, I think, a separate cell, but she was just in there with everyone. A grand jury found the lack of separate women's facilities, quote, injurious, not only to the health of the prisoners, but also to proper discipline. And so they were real upset that she had to stay with these men. So between 1888 and 1895, They didn't have any women in the prison, actually. Any woman who was sentenced to more than a year in Idaho was actually sent to Detroit, Michigan for confinement, which I didn't know that until I did research. And so I think if they were here for like less than a year, they'd just be kept in a county jail. And after that, the prison officials promised to keep women separate in some way. And so they were kind of got that like quote unquote privilege back, I guess. So the second woman came in 1895. Her name is Margaret Hardy. She is real interesting and real terrifying, and we'll get into her.
She's got a great story.
She was kept in the hospital, isolated in the hospital, but eventually she was sent to the insane asylum in Blackfoot because of some mental breaks that she had. Between 1897 and 1905, 7 women were sentenced to prison, and they were kept up in 1890s. I always call it one house. There's a lot of different things that we call 1890s, new cell house, one house. We call it a lot of different stuff. So all those women were kept in there. And then the big catalyst for the separate women's facility was with an inmate named Josie Kensler, who we love Josie.
Oh my gosh.
Obviously, again, I won't get into her story too much right now. The warden, because she came in by herself. She came in 1897. She was the only one, and so he gave her a private room on the second floor of 1890 cell house. He brought a new bed, a new mattress, he brought pillows, and he tried to give the room, quote, as much air of comfort as possible. And then, and this will come as a surprise to no one, Josie got pregnant. The scandal is not even that, actually. The scandal comes when she claims that the warden forces her to have an abortion. Yeah. And again, I don't want to get into all the details of that, but they end up going to court for it. I think the warden and the prison physician were both fired because of this. Yeah. And that's when they started to be like, ooh, probably shouldn't keep men and women together. Yeah. And then there's this young 16-year-old. Her name is Ida Larrity. She comes in, and because she's so young, everyone is in an uproar about the fact that she's being kept with all these hardened male criminals who haven't seen a young pretty girl in however many years. Yeah. And so finally they're like, all right, we really need to keep these women separate. So, and Idaho at the time was reportedly the only state without a matron in charge of women prisoners. So it was time to have these women separate. So in 1905, the women actually move out to the warden's old house, and then they use inmate labor to build the walls around the structure. And then Warden E.L. Whitney hired his wife as matron, and most matrons, all except for the very last one, were just wives of the wardens. And this is the only exception. Her name is Lulu Rowan, and she was hired in 1961. So in 1920, so they're just living in a house, basically in a little shack. I mean, it's not a shack. It's nicer than that, but just a house. And then in 1920, Warden William Cuddy decides to create a, quote, thoroughly modern dormitory for the women. This dormitory has a concrete floor and roof. It's got 7 cells, 1 bathroom, 1 kitchen, a central day room. It's surrounded by a yard that the women can take care of. They can spend time in. They also can spend their time caring for the grounds, planting roses and, landscaping and things like that. Each cell had a toilet, electrical lights, windows, a steel bar door, and 2 bunks per cell. But the cells were so small that if both occupants were trying to get dressed or undressed, they had to take turns. Yeah. And if you come in and see that, they're tiny cells. So additional beds could be placed in the day room if all 14 bunks were full. There is at least one inmate we for sure know this happened to. Her name was Elizabeth Lacey, and she was actually claustrophobic. And so being in the small cells really freaked her out. So she demanded to be put in the day room. So she just slept in the day room. Daily life in the women's ward, they didn't have the edict to do stuff like the men did. The women were treated very differently. And you'll find this as we talk more about women. And so they didn't have to work. They would garden. They would knit. They might play games, listen to records on the Victrola. They read books and magazines. They could actually keep birds and other pets, unlike here out here in the men's area. I mean, men kept pets anyway, and we can talk about Dennis and things like that, but they were actually allowed to keep other pets. In the 50s, there was one inmate who she came in. She was actually a teacher before she was arrested. Wow. And so she taught some of the younger inmates. And so there was stuff that they could do often. And then sometimes they could go out and work in the warden's house or, like maybe help cook meals for the men or do feasts or whatever. If inmates were on good behavior and there's only a few of them, then one matron would actually take them into town for to go see the movies, or they could set up celebrations. And you talk about, Lida went out to the baseball game, and actually we have reports of some of these women actually being taken out to Pocatello. and it depending on the matron. I think some matrons were a little bit more strict than others, and some were just like, oh, they can come out, they're human too, and so it just kind of depends on the year. They could also work in the administration building, they could type, things like that. So kind of depending on skills. So this exists pretty well from about 1905, 1920 to 1960. Conditions begin to deteriorate in the women's ward, and crowding becomes an issue. Actually, me and another coworker were discussing in 1963, 14 people alone were admitted that year. So there's just people coming in, there's enough to fill up the bunks, but you have the people who are already there, and then you have the people who come in the next year. So we know for a fact we had overcrowding in the women's ward. So they attempt to build a new site for the women in Idaho, but because of overcrowding of male inmates, they actually keep the building for men. They actually do this a couple of times where they try to build a new building and then the men end up taking over because there are too many men. So the women's ward here on site, actually, it closes on July 1st, 1968. Current Idaho State female inmates were sent first to the prison in Carson City, Nevada, but inmates actually wrote the warden and complained to the Board of Corrections that there was overcrowding, there was poor medical treatment. It just wasn't, they didn't like it there. So they ended up being moved to the Oregon State Penitentiary in Salem. And then, it's kind of weird if you're sentenced in Idaho to be sent to Oregon. Right. So they try to find a place in Idaho again. They just get bounced around from place to place. So first they try the North Idaho Correctional Institution, which was a former U.S. Air Force radar station. But that also got taken over by the men. Oh my gosh. And so then as these women, they're just in limbo. And so a class action lawsuit is filed by the American Civil Liberties Union to try to get these women their own building because this is ridiculous. So they try to relocate them to the campus of State Hospital North in Orofino. So it was a mental, what they called an insane asylum and then a mental health hospital. They try to relocate them to that campus. That doesn't work. So then finally, that leads to a correctional facility that's built in Pocatello in 1994. It has a capacity of 108 women. Oh. So any women who who need to be incarcerated are kept there in Pocatello. And that's where it has been since. So for 25 years, that is where that has been. So while the women's ward was open, it was home to a total of 217 women. The women's ward inmates sometimes referred to themselves as the forgotten women. And so I'm kind of here to make sure that they aren't forgotten. And so I just I'm so happy to be doing this for them and get their stories out there because they are a little bit ignored when we talk about the prison. And they shouldn't be because their stories are truly incredible. And so I can't wait to get into those.
Yeah. Most tours don't, lead you out the front doors into the women's ward. It kind of ends with, oh yeah, there's also a women's ward. Go check that out, I guess, after your tours. So we're hoping to
unless you have me and I try to talk about women in the walls as much as possible. And I'm and the only thing that you can see when you leave is the women. You cannot leave without going into the women's. I will take you in there if you need me to.
Yeah. Oh, well. Thank you all for sticking through to this point.
Probably a long one.
Wow, hearing this giant history of this prison, in this state. I mean, that was so much to go through. But I think it's a good introduction to what this podcast is going to be like. And if you wanted a 17-minute version of this podcast, Doing Time is probably it.
But
it comes with pictures.
You guys should, if you don't come in to watch the video, you can just watch it on YouTube. Yes. It's called Doing Time.
With an apostrophe at the end of doing.
Not doing.
Yeah,
doing.
Doing Time.
To my favorite part of the video that we show here at the penitentiary, she married him and buried him in the most Western accent possible. I hear it constantly as I sit at the front desk. Yeah. It makes me laugh every time. Every time. I think it is so funny. Married him and buried him.
I like the part where they say irons. Irons.
Yeah, so next week we'll get into our first inmate stories.
Yes. Well, do your own time and
do your own number.
Yeah, we'll see you next week.